Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The story of England's bloodiest civil war begins long before the first sword was drawn, decades earlier, in the glittering yet fragile court of King Edward III. His reign, marked by triumphs in France and glory on the battlefield, seemed to secure the Plantagenet dynasty as unshakable. Yet Edward's decision, for the first time in English history, to create duchies for his sons, grants of immense land and wealth, planted seeds of a different future. He sought to honor his bloodline and stabilize the realm, but instead he created a generation of princes who could rival the very crown their father wore. The five surviving sons of Edward III would become the roots of two great houses, the Red of Lancaster and the White of York, and the source of 30 years of slaughter. Edward's eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, was England's hero, brilliant at Crécy, victorious at Poitiers, adored by soldiers and feared by foes. His death in 1376, a year before his father's, shattered the succession. The crown passed not to another seasoned warrior, but to his 10-year-old son, Richard II. The boy king inherited not only a realm exhausted by war, but also the resentment of a nobility growing rich and restless under weak leadership. As plague, taxation, and poverty festered among the commons, rebellion simmered beneath the surface, exploding in the peasants' revolt of 1381, when London itself burned with fury. Richard, still a teenager, suppressed it with deceptive calm, but the fire of mistrust between king and subject would never truly die. In the halls of Westminster, the lords whispered of tyranny. Richard's court became a place of vanity and fear, lavish pageantry masking paranoia. His marriage to Anne of Bohemia brought peace with one foreign power, but alienated others. His efforts to reconcile with France through the marriage of a child princess made him look weak. When his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, was exiled in 1398, few foresaw how swiftly fortune would turn. As Richard sailed to Ireland to suppress rebellion, Bolingbroke returned to England, gathering allies from noble houses long humiliated by the king's rule. Richard's authority evaporated almost overnight. Betrayed, captured, and deposed, he was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, where he died in 1400, his end shrouded in mystery but widely believed to be murder. Henry Bolingbroke's coronation as Henry IV marked the birth of the House of Lancaster and the beginning of England's hereditary curse. His claim rested on conquest rather than clear succession. He had deposed a rightful king and bypassed Edmund Mortimer, another grandson of Edward III, who held a stronger blood claim. The moral fracture in the crown could not be mended by ceremony. For every loyal lord who swore allegiance to the new king, another saw opportunity and defiance. Rebellions flared like sparks in a drought. The Percy Uprising in the north, Welsh revolts under Owain Glyndwr, whispers from disinherited nobles. Henry's reign was consumed by insecurity, his body racked by chronic illness, his sleep haunted by guilt and prophecy. Yet the Lancastrian line endured. Through his son, the young Henry V, whose fire and discipline would restore the crown's dignity abroad, even as it bled at home. In 1415, amid the mud of Agincourt, the English arrows darkened the sky, and France itself trembled before the might of England's warrior king. Henry's victories, sealed in the Treaty of Troyes of 1420, made him heir to the French throne and husband to Catherine of Valois. It seemed England's destiny was written in gold and blood, a kingdom that would stretch across the Channel, ruled by one man. But triumph is fragile. Within 2 years, both Henry V and France's King Charles VI were dead. A baby, not yet old enough to speak, now wore two crowns. Henry VI was King of England and France, heir to an empire his father had built but could never defend. The peace Henry V had carved with the sword would not outlive him, and as the infant king grew, so too did the ambitions of men who claimed to serve him. The duchies Edward III had once gifted to bind his sons would soon tear their descendants apart. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York had yet to bloom, but the soil of England was already fertile with betrayal. When Henry IV died in 1413, the crown passed to his son, young, battle-tested, and burning with purpose. Henry V was everything his father was not: charismatic, disciplined, and untainted by rebellion. He had watched his father's legitimacy questioned for years and was determined to silence doubt not with words, but with conquest. To the English people, he seemed ordained by God to redeem the crown his father had stolen. In his veins, ambition burned as fiercely as faith. 2 years after his coronation, Henry sought to revive England's fading claim to France. The Hundred Years' War, once a distant legacy of Edward III, flared to life again. In 1415, as autumn rains drenched northern France, the young king's small and sickly army faced overwhelming odds near a village called Agincourt. Mud sucked at the boots of knights, arrows hissed through the mist, and the flower of French nobility fell beneath the English longbow. It was a triumph of grit over grandeur, of order over chaos. Agincourt made Henry a legend and transformed England's humiliation into glory. Over the next 5 years, Henry V pressed deeper into France, capturing cities and castles with relentless efficiency. In 1420, he secured the Treaty of Troyes, marrying Catherine of Valois, daughter of the deranged French king Charles VI. The treaty named Henry and his heirs as successors to the French crown. In that moment, England appeared invincible, a single realm spanning 2 kingdoms, bound by marriage, sanctified by victory. Yet beneath the triumph lay a fatal fragility. 2 years later, both monarchs, Henry and Charles, were dead. Henry's heir, Henry VI, was barely a year old. In England and in occupied France, the sound of a baby's cry replaced the thunder of war drums. The new king's uncles, John, Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, assumed regency, Bedford governing the war in France, Gloucester handling England's fragile domestic affairs. Bedford was capable, pragmatic, and loyal, but even he could not stop what was coming. In France, the tide of history turned. A peasant girl, Joan of Arc, rose from obscurity, claiming divine visions and rallying French hearts. Her courage inspired armies and fractured the English illusion of destiny. By 1429, the French crowned their own monarch, Charles VII, in the Cathedral of Reims, the same sacred place where English regents had hoped to enthrone Henry VI. The dual monarchy had collapsed into symbolism. The boy king of England ruled France only on parchment. When Henry VI reached adulthood in 1437, the regency ended, and so did the last traces of competence. Where his father had been made of iron, Henry was made of wax, gentle, devout, and painfully pliable. His court split into rival camps: the peace faction, led by Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, and the war faction, led by his uncle Gloucester and the ambitious Richard, Duke of York. The king, seeking harmony, trusted the wrong men. In 1444, Henry agreed to a peace treaty at Tours, marrying Margaret of Anjou, niece of the French king. The terms were generous, too generous. England returned Maine and Anjou to France, losing vital territory in exchange for a fragile marriage alliance. The deal was seen as betrayal, and public fury erupted. Henry's queen, though intelligent and strong-willed, was French-born, instantly distrusted by her new subjects. Gloucester, who protested the treaty, was imprisoned and died mysteriously soon after. To many, his death smelled of murder. Somerset, once a minor noble, now wielded extraordinary power as the king's favorite. Meanwhile, Richard of York, stripped of his command in France and exiled to Ireland, seethed in silence. The English possessions in France crumbled. Normandy fell. By 1450, only Calais remained. Suffolk, the architect of peace, was exiled and murdered at sea before reaching France. England's prestige was gone, its treasury bankrupt, its nobles restless. The soil was shifting, and no one at court could feel the ground breaking beneath their feet. By the mid-15th century, England was a realm without balance. The very duchies Edward III had once created had grown monstrous, their lords commanding armies larger than the king's. Loyalty was no longer sworn to the crown, but to powerful patrons. The age of bastard feudalism, where gold and favor replaced chivalry and law. Henry VI, too kind to rule and too weak to resist, clung to prayer while his kingdom slipped away. And beyond the palace walls, another heir of Edward III, Richard of York, waited in exile, patient and calculating. He was the great-grandson of a king, the richest noble in England, and the last man the Lancastrian court wanted to remember. Yet history had not forgotten him. The balance of power, fragile as glass, was about to shatter. And when it did, the roses, one red, one white, would bloom in blood. By 1447, the kingdom Henry VI inherited was little more than a crumbling echo of his father's empire. The victories of Agincourt and Troy were distant legends, their glory fading beneath the weight of debt, corruption, and defeat. The English armies in France, once feared across Europe, now fought to survive, their pay delayed, their morale shattered. The peasants at home faced famine and taxation, while the nobility schemed for the remnants of royal favor. England was drifting toward the edge of chaos, and the king seemed powerless to stop it. In London, the court split along invisible battle lines. The peace party, led by Somerset and Suffolk, whispered soothing promises into the king's ear, urging conciliation with France. Across the aisle stood the war faction, led by Gloucester and Richard, Duke of York, men who believed England's honor was worth fighting for. Margaret of Anjou, barely 16, clever and proud, quickly became the central axis of power, overshadowing her fragile husband. Her presence, so often commanding in public, only deepened suspicion among those who saw her as a foreign queen steering England into ruin. When the Duke of Gloucester protested Henry's disastrous peace terms, he was arrested on dubious charges and found dead in prison days later. The message was clear: opposition would not be tolerated. York, stripped of his command in France and sent to govern Ireland, understood his exile for what it was: a warning and a humiliation. Meanwhile, Somerset and Suffolk, elevated to dukedoms, tightened their grip on the king, though Suffolk's sudden murder at sea in 1450 revealed how brittle royal protection had become. Even the nobles who held power lived under the shadow of the mob. Across the Channel, catastrophe struck. Normandy collapsed, and with it the illusion of England's continental power. Soldiers returning from France roamed the countryside unpaid and embittered, turning their swords against their own countrymen. Those who had lost estates abroad, men of birth and pride, blamed the king's council for their ruin. Rebellion flared, first in the south, then the east. In Kent, an uprising led by the mysterious Jack Cade shook London itself, calling for an end to corruption and demanding reforms that echoed the grievances of Richard II's time. Cade's rebellion was crushed, but it revealed the truth. England's subjects no longer feared the crown. At the same time, noble rivalries hardened into private wars. In the north, two great families, the Nevilles and the Percys, clashed violently over land and honor. Their feud became a miniature civil war, unchecked by royal authority. Somerset favored the Percys. The Nevilles turned to Richard of York for protection. It was not yet a war for the throne, but the lines of allegiance were forming, and the king's weakness ensured they would soon be tested. In 1453, news reached England that would break its king's mind: the final loss of Bordeaux and Aquitaine, the jewels of the Plantagenet crown. The humiliation was complete. After a century of war, all that remained of England's French possessions was Calais. The strain proved too much. Henry VI collapsed into a trance-like state, silent, motionless, unresponsive. For months he did not speak, recognize faces, or command a thought. The kingdom now had a monarch in body only, and power drifted toward the ambitious. Margaret of Anjou, heavily pregnant, sought to preserve what authority she could. Her son, Edward of Westminster, born during the king's madness, became a symbol of hope for the Lancastrian cause. Yet with Henry incapacitated, the council turned to the only man of sufficient rank and competence to lead, Richard, Duke of York. Appointed protector of the realm in 1454, he quickly set about restoring order. Somerset was imprisoned, the Queen sidelined, and York's allies, the Nevilles, Salisbury, and Warwick, placed in positions of influence. For a fleeting moment, England felt the hand of leadership again. But Henry's sudden recovery shattered that order as swiftly as it had come. Awaking as if from a long sleep, he reinstated Somerset, dismissed York, and returned authority to the Queen's circle. To Margaret and her allies, York's ambition was clear. Protector today, pretender tomorrow. To York, the message was equally clear. His enemies would never rest until he was destroyed. By the spring of 1455, England's politics had crossed the point of return. Armies began to gather, one under the royal banner of Lancaster, another under York's white rose. For years, England's feuds had been fought in whispers and parliaments. Now, the nobles who had once dined together would meet with pikes and arrows. The madness of one king, the ambition of one duke, and the silence of the crown had set the course for civil war. Soon, the fields of St. Albans would run red, the opening act of a tragedy that would consume the dynasty of Edward III and leave a kingdom scarred for generations. The realm that Edward III once forged in iron was now hollowed out by distrust and greed. England had become a kingdom ruled not by its monarch, but by the tempers of its magnates. The common folk, weary of foreign defeats and endless taxation, whispered of divine punishment, while the nobility sharpened their swords and gathered their private retinues. The crown was still on Henry II's head, but its weight was borne by others. The authority of kingship, once sacred, had been auctioned off to the most ambitious bidders. The loss of France was not merely territorial, it was spiritual. Generations had grown up under the illusion that England's destiny lay across the Channel, that the victories of Edward III and Henry V were divine affirmation of a chosen people. But by the 1450s, that illusion lay in ashes. Veterans of France, hardened, desperate men, returned home to find nothing but hunger and neglect. They became mercenaries, bodyguards, and thieves, serving the noble who could pay the most. England had entered the dark age of bastard feudalism, where loyalty was a commodity, armies were personal property, and kings were little more than figureheads in their own courts. Henry VI, kind but indecisive, prayed instead of ruled. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, fierce and unyielding, filled the void. Though foreign-born, she carried the fire that her husband lacked, and she would use that fire to defend her son's inheritance at any cost. But her assertiveness, her influence over the gentle, pliable king, became a lightning rod for resentment. To the lords of England, Margaret was no queen consort. She was a foreign interloper manipulating a saintly but feeble husband. Among her opponents, none loomed larger than Richard, Duke of York. A great-grandson of Edward III, he possessed both the blood and the ambition to rival the throne itself. His claim was stronger than Henry's by strict lineage, though he never dared to voice it, at least not yet. Instead, he spoke of reform, of justice, of restoring order. But beneath his calm exterior burned the pride of a man who had tasted power as protector and would not accept exile again. The realm was splintering into factions defined not by ideals, but by allegiance. On one side stood the Lancastrians, the court loyalists, the crown's favorites, and those who thrived under Margaret's patronage. On the other, the Yorkists, a coalition of disillusioned nobles led by York and bolstered by the powerful Neville family, including his allies Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and Salisbury's son Warwick, the young and charismatic kingmaker. Between them stood a king too weak to unite them and too gentle to condemn them. As 1454 faded into 1455, the machinery of government collapsed. Lawlessness spread like rot through the countryside. Old feuds reignited in blood. In the north, the Percys and the Nevilles waged open war, their men fighting pitched battles under banners bearing family crests rather than the royal arms. The crown's authority was mocked in its own shires. No order from London could reach beyond the shadow of castle walls. England was drifting toward anarchy, its fate decided not in Parliament but in armed camps. In February 1455, Queen Margaret gave birth to her long-awaited son, Edward of Westminster. The infant's arrival should have united the kingdom. It instead deepened the divide. With an heir, the Lancastrian cause no longer depended on Henry's fragile life. The Queen's faction became emboldened, while York's allies feared permanent exclusion from power. As Henry's mind recovered from his long stupor, York's authority as protector evaporated overnight. Somerset, newly released from prison, resumed his position as royal favorite. York was dismissed, His reforms undone, his name whispered with accusation. Pride and fear now ruled both camps. Margaret and Somerset were determined to destroy York before he could gather strength again. York, unwilling to bend, decided on the only course left to him: arms. He summoned his allies, Salisbury and Warwick, to muster their retainers in the north. By May, thousands of men who had once fought side by side in France, now marched under rival banners through the heart of England. The king, still believing himself a peacemaker, called for a great council at St. Albans, hoping to reconcile the factions. But both sides came armed. Henry's small army of 2,000 men, loyal to the crown but unsure of their cause, marched south to confront York's far larger host. Negotiations were attempted but failed when the Yorkists demanded Somerset's arrest and the Queen refused. The kingdom that had once united to conquer France now turned its swords inward. St. Albans would be no mere skirmish. It would be the breaking of the realm. The roses, red for Lancaster, white for York, had finally been chosen. And before the day was done, the market square of an English town would be drenched in royal blood. The morning of May 22, 1455, dawned gray and uncertain over the market town of St. Albans. Its narrow lanes and timbered houses were not built for war, yet before noon they would become the killing ground of England's first civil battle. On one side stood the royal army of King Henry VI, numbering perhaps 2,000 men, Somerset, Northumberland, and Clifford among its commanders. On the other, the banners of York, Warwick, and Salisbury rose above a force twice their size. The white rose of York fluttered beside the king's own red dragon. Few understood what was coming. Fewer still would leave unchanged. At first, both camps sought to avoid bloodshed. York sent envoys to the king, kneeling before their sovereign's name, pleading only for Somerset's dismissal. Henry, guided by his queen's loyalists, refused. To yield Somerset, he believed, would make him a puppet of rebellion. Diplomacy died in the silence that followed. Shortly after 10 in the morning, Warwick, ever impatient, ever daring, gave the signal to advance. The quiet streets of St. Albans erupted with the thunder of armor and the cries of men charging through doorways and gardens. The Lancastrians held the town's gates at Sopwell and Shropshire Lane, transforming cottages into barricades. Arrows hissed through the smoke, and crossbow bolts clattered off shields in the maze of alleys. York's first assaults faltered under the cramped conditions. Men died without ever seeing the enemy's face. Civilians fled into cellars as the smell of powder and pitch filled the air. For an hour, it was chaos. Neither army gaining ground, the din echoing between the church spires. Then Warwick made his mark on history. He detached a reserve force and, guided by locals, slipped through the gardens behind the town toward the market square, where the king's standard fluttered. The maneuver was daring and desperate, executed in silence until the final moment. As bells rang from the abbey, Warwick's men burst from cover, striking the Lancastrian rear like a hammer. The defenders, believing they were surrounded, broke ranks. Panic spread down the narrow streets, and soon the royal lines folded in upon themselves. In minutes, the battle was decided. Somerset, Northumberland, and Clifford fell in the melee, their blood soaking the cobbles. The king himself was wounded by an arrow in the neck and dragged from his tent amid the confusion. As the fighting subsided, York rode into the market square and knelt beside Henry, who was trembling but alive. York ordered that the royal physicians tend to him and proclaimed loyalty to the crown, even as his soldiers stripped armor from the corpses of royal lords. It was a gesture both of mercy and of theater. York had captured not just the king, but the narrative. The victors led Henry back to London under escort, presenting him to Parliament as though they had rescued him from corrupt advisers rather than fought against his banner. Somerset was dead, the Queen's influence broken, and York was once again named protector of the realm. To many, it appeared that peace had been restored, yet the peace of 1455 was nothing more than a ceasefire drawn in blood. Margaret of Anjou, furious and unbowed, refused to accept her husband's humiliation. In her mind, York had struck not at a minister, but at the monarchy itself. The White Rose had triumphed at St. Albans, but the victory carried a terrible price. England's nobility had learned that private armies could decide the fate of kings. that royal authority could be seized by force and justified later with words. The spell of divine monarchy, the belief that rebellion against the king was rebellion against God, had been shattered. As summer gave way to autumn, London celebrated York's triumph with processions and prayers. But beyond the capital, vengeance took root. The widows of Somerset and Northumberland plotted revenge. Queen Margaret began to raise new allies in the north. In taverns and manors across the realm, men began choosing sides. They did not yet know the scale of the storm they had unleashed. The Wars of the Roses had begun, and England, once united under the cross of St. George, was now a nation divided by the colors of its own flowers. The aftermath of St. Albans left England stunned. A king wounded, nobles dead in the streets, and a queen burning with vengeance. These were the new realities of a fractured realm. Richard of York rode through London as the kingdom's protector once more, but his authority rested on fear, not reverence. He had seized the king's person, but he had also awakened a far greater enemy. Queen Margaret of Anjou, exiled to the shadows after her husband's humiliation, was now preparing to reclaim both her power and her family's honor. While Henry VI drifted between bouts of frailty and brief lucidity, Margaret's will hardened into iron. She was no longer the shy girl who had arrived from France a decade earlier. She was a mother and a queen of war. With the death of Somerset, she became the nucleus around which the surviving Lancastrians gathered. In the halls of northern castles and the abbeys of Wales, her envoys moved quietly, weaving new alliances among those who had suffered under York's ascendancy. For every noble who bent the knee to York in Parliament, 2 more whispered oaths to Margaret in secret. From 1456 to 1459, England lived in a fragile illusion of peace. Parliament reconvened, laws were passed, York's sons were knighted. But beneath the surface, every region simmered with tension. The north belonged to the Queen, the south to York. Between them stretched a no-man's land of shifting loyalties and empty promises. York's ally, Warwick the Kingmaker, secured command of Calais and controlled the Channel, but even his brilliance could not soothe the fractures at home. England's government was paralyzed. Each decree debated, each appointment contested, as if the crown itself no longer carried meaning. In 1458, the Archbishop of Canterbury attempted to stage a love day in London, a public reconciliation between the rival houses. Under the vaulted ceiling of St. Paul's Cathedral, Henry, pale and trembling, walked hand in hand with York and Margaret as crowds looked on in uneasy silence. Yet, even in this symbolic truce, eyes betrayed hatred. Behind the polite gestures, the smell of powder lingered in the air. England was not healed, it was holding its breath. Margaret, ever pragmatic, understood that words could not mend what blood had already broken. She began to fortify her position in the north, drawing the support of powerful families, the Percys, the Cliffords, the Tudors of Wales, those who saw York's dominance as a threat to the old nobility. When the King's Council met in 1459 at Coventry, she ensured that Yorkist sympathizers were excluded. Richard of York, sensing the trap, withdrew to his estates, then fled to Ludlow with his allies Salisbury and Warwick. By autumn, the facade of peace had collapsed entirely. At Blore Heath, Salisbury's Yorkist column was intercepted by a Lancastrian force twice its size. The Yorkists, veterans of France, held their ground and routed the Queen's army, killing Lord Audley and scattering his men. It was a shocking victory, but it came at a terrible cost. The country was now openly at war, and both factions began raising levies as though England were 2 nations. At Ludford Bridge, near the Welsh border, Margaret's army, swollen by the king's standard, confronted York's rebels. Facing the royal banner, symbol of divine authority, many of York's soldiers wavered. When a detachment from Calais defected, panic spread. York fled across the sea to Ireland. Warwick and Salisbury escaped to Calais. The rebellion had collapsed, and with it York's fragile claim to legitimacy. For Margaret, the moment was vindication. Her enemies had fled. Her husband was once again under her guidance. Yet the victory was hollow. The rebellion's leaders were gone, not destroyed. In the quiet halls of Westminster, she had their estates seized and their names declared traitorous, but she could not erase their cause. In Calais, Warwick nursed his wounded pride and sharpened his ambitions. In Ireland, Richard of York plotted with his sons. His fury cooled into strategy. The queen believed she had restored the Lancastrian crown. In truth, she had only given the war a second breath. England's nobles were exhausted but unbroken. The armies they had raised would soon return. And as Margaret's infant son was baptized beneath the banners of victory, another child was growing into manhood across the Irish Sea. York's heir, Edward, tall, golden-haired, and waiting. Within a year, he would return to England carrying not just his father's banner, but his vengeance. The red and white roses had drawn first blood, but the Garden of England was only beginning to bloom with death. Winter gripped England in 1460, but the cold could not still the fever of rebellion. Exiled lords plotted in Calais, their ships prowling the grey channel, while Richard of York watched from Ireland, his mind turning every defeat into fuel. The Queen's triumph at Ludford had brought no peace, only tyranny cloaked in royal decree. Her council governed through intimidation. Her husband, Henry VI, drifted further into a trance-like passivity. And in the absence of justice, York's cause began to sound not like rebellion, but redemption. It was Warwick, the kingmaker, more than any other man, who rekindled the war. Commanding the strategic port of Calais, he harassed Lancastrian shipping and spread Yorkist propaganda across southern England. His ships carried not only soldiers, but words, pamphlets proclaiming loyalty to the true line of Edward III and denouncing the corruption of the Queen's court. These words found eager listeners. The merchants of London, weary of instability and French influence, quietly began to side with York's faction. In the summer of 1460, Warwick, Salisbury, and York's son Edward, Earl of March, landed on the Kentish coast. Their banners bore the white rose, now a symbol known in every corner of the realm. The Lancastrian forces, taken by surprise, scattered as the Yorkists marched toward the capital. London opened its gates to them without resistance. For the first time in a decade, York's party held the heart of England. King Henry, loyal to his queen's cause, mustered what troops he could near Northampton. The ensuing battle was brief and brutal. The king's army, soaked by relentless rain, faltered as Warwick's disciplined soldiers advanced under the thunder of cannon. Within an hour, the royal camp was overrun. Henry was captured once again, his tent riddled with arrow holes, his crown untouched, but his dignity gone. The victorious lords escorted him to London, their banners glistening in the downpour. When Richard of York returned from Ireland that autumn, it was as a man transformed. No longer the cautious reformer, he now entered Westminster wearing royal colors, his sword carried upright before him. In a moment that stunned Parliament, he strode to the empty throne of England, placed his hand upon it, and waited. Silence filled the hall. At last he spoke, the words measured but unmistakable. "I am come to claim my inheritance." The assembly erupted in chaos. Some lords protested, others whispered their approval. The king, fragile and mild, said nothing. After days of deliberation, a compromise emerged, the Act of Accord. Henry VI would reign for the rest of his life, but upon his death, the crown would pass not to his son, Edward of Westminster, but to Richard of York and his heirs. It was a settlement built on logic and sealed with betrayal. To Margaret of Anjou, it was nothing less than the theft of her child's future. The queen retreated north, rallying loyalists under the red rose of Lancaster. Her charisma and the promise of revenge drew thousands to her side, Scots, northern lords, and dispossessed soldiers who had lost everything to York's ambition. She called upon the blood feuds that had simmered for years, and they answered. Within months, she had assembled an army 3 times the size of York's. In December, Richard marched north with his son Edmund of Rutland and the veteran Earl of Salisbury to intercept her. Snow blanketed the countryside as his small force reached Sandal Castle near Wakefield. Scouts reported Margaret's army encamped nearby, yet York, confident and rash, believed the queen's forces disorganized. On the final days of the year, he rode out from the castle with 5,000 men to strike what he thought was a scattered foe. But Margaret had planned well. Her commanders, Somerset, Clifford, and Andrew Trollope, had concealed their numbers and lured York into open ground. Surrounded on all sides, the Yorkist army was crushed in hours. The Duke himself was slain, his banner trampled in the snow. His young son Edmund was captured while fleeing and murdered on the roadside. Their heads were set upon spikes above the gates of York, crowned mockingly with paper crowns. The death of Richard of York was meant to end the rebellion. Instead, it gave it a martyr. News of his fall spread like wildfire through England. In the south, his eldest son Edward, only 18, gathered the remnants of their armies. Tall, fair, and fearless, he was everything his father was not: decisive, charming, and unburdened by caution. Under his banner, the white rose rose again. By early 1461, England stood on the brink once more. Margaret's armies marched south with the captive king in tow, while Edward advanced from Wales with Warwick's seasoned veterans at his side. Both sides claimed divine right, both swore loyalty to the same crown, and both saw annihilation as the only path to peace. Ahead lay Towton, a field of snow and death, where the fate of two dynasties and England itself would be decided. The last days of March 1461 were shrouded in snow and silence. In the fields between the villages of Towton and Saxton, tens of thousands of Englishmen gathered to decide the fate of their kingdom. On one side stood Edward of York, barely 19, commanding a weary but determined army of 30,000 men. On the other, Henry VI's Lancastrians, some 35,000 strong, led by Somerset and Northumberland, hardened by vengeance and blessed by the Queen's fiery resolve. Between them lay a windswept ridge and the promise of death. The armies met on Palm Sunday, beneath skies heavy with snow. The wind howled across the fields, driving sleet into the faces of the Lancastrians, while whipping behind Edward's ranks. As the lines formed, banners of every hue, red dragons, white roses, golden lions, snapped in the frozen gale. Before dawn, the snow began to fall in sheets, blurring friend and foe alike. It was as though the heavens themselves wished to hide the slaughter about to unfold. Edward, towering and resolute, rode before his men in gleaming armor. Unlike his pious father, he had no illusions of divine destiny, only the conviction that he must win or die. He raised his sword, its silver edge catching a glimmer of light, and gave a single order: archers forward. Across the line, thousands of longbowmen stepped into position. The first volleys tore through the snowstorm, but the wind, strong and merciless, carried the Lancastrian arrows short. The Yorkist archers laughed and advanced a few paces, collecting their enemies' fallen shafts before firing them back with deadly precision. Blinded and battered, the Lancastrians were forced to descend from the ridge. Their war horns sounded, and the great mass of infantry charged through the snow, shouting, "King Henry!" Edward's men met them in silence. The clash was deafening, the sound of steel against steel, of boots sinking into frozen mud, of men grunting and screaming as they fought hand to hand. The blizzard thickened, the ground turned red. The living stumbled over the dead. For hours, the battle raged in chaos. Warwick and Norfolk's banners vanished in the storm. At one point, Edward's left flank began to buckle under pressure from Somerset's assault, threatening to unravel the Yorkist line. Seeing this, the young king threw himself into the fray, sword flashing, his armor streaked with blood. His courage steadied his troops. He fought like a man possessed, as if by sheer will he could command the outcome of history. Then, at the height of the struggle, reinforcements under John Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, arrived on the field, late but decisive. They struck the Lancastrian flank like a thunderbolt. The red banners wavered, then broke. Panic spread as shouts of retreat drowned out the screams. The Yorkists pursued relentlessly down the slope, cutting men to pieces in the snow. Many tried to flee across the Cockbeck River, its banks slick with ice and blood. The water ran crimson as soldiers drowned beneath the weight of armor, or were butchered midstream. Chroniclers later claimed 28,000 men lay dead before nightfall, though none could truly count. When the sun finally pierced the clouds, the field of Towton was a graveyard. Helmets lay crushed, banners trampled, bodies frozen where they fell. The snow, once pure and white, had turned to mud the color of rust. Among the corpses lay nobles, knights, and commoners alike. England's feudal class decimated in a single day. Never again would the medieval chivalry of England stand so tall or fall so low. Edward entered York a victor. The heads of Somerset and Northumberland were displayed above the city gates, replacing the paper crowns that had mocked his father. He was crowned King Edward IV, not by inheritance, but by conquest. London greeted him with cheers, the merchants and guildsmen swearing allegiance to the sun in splendor, his chosen emblem, radiant and defiant against the storm. For a moment, peace seemed possible. The Lancastrian cause lay shattered. Henry and Margaret fled to Scotland, and the realm, exhausted by war, longed for stability. But even as Edward's coronation bells rang through Westminster, the embers of rebellion still glowed in the north. Those who had lost everything at Towton would not forgive. The War of the Roses was far from over. It had merely changed hands, from a weak king's burden to a young conqueror's prize. The blood in the snow had bought a crown, but it had also sown a curse. Every victory in this war carried the shadow of its own destruction. The spring of 1461 brought England a fragile calm. After Towton, the crown rested firmly upon the brow of Edward IV, the first Yorkist king. At only 19, he appeared born for kingship, tall, commanding, and dazzling in charm. London adored him. Merchants hailed him as a restorer of stability. The clergy blessed his rule, and exhausted soldiers knelt to the promise of peace. But beneath the jubilation, old loyalties smoldered. The roses might have been cut, yet their roots were still alive. Edward began his reign with confidence and clemency. He pardoned many former enemies, believing reconciliation would heal the realm. Even some who had fought under Margaret's banner were restored to their lands, including Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and the volatile Ralph Percy. To Edward, mercy was a political weapon, an act of strength rather than sentiment. His most powerful ally, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, now stood as the realm's second most influential man. Warwick's influence stretched from the Channel to the Scottish borders, and in those early years the partnership between the young king and the kingmaker seemed unbreakable. Warwick secured Edward's northern borders, recapturing rebel castles at Alnwick, Bamberg, and Dunstanburgh. By 1463, he had crushed the last Lancastrian resistance in Northumberland. Margaret and her son, Prince Edward, fled to France, penniless and desperate. There, the exiled queen begged the French king, Louis the Béarn, for aid, trading promises and royal favors for ships and soldiers. England, though outwardly stable, had merely shifted its war abroad. At home, Edward's court glittered with new life. Unlike Henry VI, who cloaked himself in piety and prayer, Edward reveled in the vibrancy of kingship. He was a soldier and a statesman, but also a man of pleasure. He dined lavishly, dressed magnificently, and moved among his people with a warmth that bordered on theatrical. For a while, it worked. The people forgot the years of anarchy. They saw in him not a conqueror, but a savior. Yet to the nobility, especially Warwick, Edward's independence was beginning to sting. Warwick had long envisioned himself as the architect of the Yorkist crown, the king's mentor and master of foreign policy. But Edward, ever self-willed, began charting his own course. Warwick pressed for a marriage alliance with France to secure peace on the continent, proposing that Edward wed Princess Anne of France. The plan would cement an Anglo-French pact and strengthen Warwick's hand as the kingdom's diplomat. But when the proposal was brought before the council, Edward revealed a secret that shattered everything. The young king had already married Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of a Lancastrian knight, in a private ceremony a year earlier. She was beautiful, ambitious, and from a family of minor nobility. For Warwick and the aristocracy, it was a scandal. A king's marriage was meant to be a matter of statecraft, not love. Warwick's fury was immediate and absolute. He had been made a fool in the eyes of Europe. Edward's decision changed the balance of power within the court overnight. The Woodville family rose swiftly, acquiring titles and marriages that replaced Warwick's allies. The old nobility seethed at their arrogance. At banquets, whispers began again, of corruption, favoritism, and betrayal. Warwick, once the crown's greatest champion, began to see himself not as Edward's servant, but as his rival. Even as domestic politics darkened, Edward sought to strengthen his foreign alliances. In 1463, he turned away from France and forged ties with Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, a move that directly undermined Warwick's pro-French policy. The alliance angered Louis XV, who, in turn, rekindled his support for the exiled Queen Margaret and the Lancastrian cause. The chessboard of English politics was once again set for war, this time between king and kingmaker. For the moment, Edward stood confident, believing his throne secure, his enemies crushed, his realm reborn. But power built on charm and compromise is never steady. In the shadows of peace, envy gathered like storm clouds. Warwick's pride would not sleep forever, and Margaret's exiled court in France was learning to dream once more. The War of the Roses was not over. It had merely paused to catch its breath. By the mid-1460s, the glittering alliance that had crowned Edward IV began to corrode. The young king had proven himself independent, too independent for the proud Earl of Warwick, who had made and unmade monarchs with the stroke of a sword. Once partners in power, Edward and Warwick now eyed one another with growing suspicion, each convinced he was the true guardian of England's destiny. At first, the fractures were quiet. Warwick's advice on foreign policy was ignored. His pro-French overtures were blocked when Edward turned toward Burgundy, arranging a commercial alliance and courting Charles the Bold. To Warwick, this was heresy. He had staked his prestige on France, and now his king had betrayed him. Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville deepened the insult. Her family, ambitious, cunning, and newly ennobled, dominated the royal court. Her brothers and sisters were married into England's leading houses, squeezing out the old nobility who had fought for the Yorkist cause. Warwick, who had expected gratitude, found himself isolated in a palace filled with Woodvilles. He was not the only one nursing resentment. Many lords, impoverished by years of war, saw the Woodvilles' meteoric rise as an affront to the social order. At feasts, they muttered that Edward was bewitched by his queen's beauty, that her kin had the hearts of spiders and the smiles of saints. For Warwick, these whispers became weapons. He began to gather those disaffected nobles into a network of quiet rebellion. His eldest daughter, Isabel Neville, married Edward's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, a match that defied the king's orders and bound Warwick to a potential heir to the throne. By 1467, the rift could no longer be hidden. Edward publicly dismissed Warwick's envoys, cancelled his negotiations with France, and announced new treaties with Burgundy. The insult was absolute. The kingmaker withdrew from court, furious and humiliated. 2 years later, he struck back. Under the pretext of suppressing disorder, Warwick's retainers incited uprisings in the north. He claimed loyalty to Edward while secretly plotting his downfall. His plan, to replace the ungrateful monarch with a more obedient one, his son-in-law, Clarence. In 1469, rebellion erupted. The Neville retainers marched under false colors, claiming to rise against corrupt counselors. Warwick and Clarence declared themselves defenders of justice. Edward, caught off guard, scrambled to assemble loyal forces. At Edgecote Moor, the royal army was ambushed and destroyed. Edward himself was captured while retreating toward London. For a few stunned weeks, England once again had a king in name, but not in command. Warwick ruled in his stead, issuing proclamations in the king's name and purging Woodville influence from the court. But the illusion crumbled almost immediately. Warwick had underestimated the depth of Edward's popularity. The merchants of London, the guilds, even many nobles who despised the Woodvilles, refused to support what they saw as treason masked in legality. Disorder swept the countryside. Warwick's men struggled to control the chaos they had unleashed. Within months, he was forced to release Edward, who returned to his throne with disarming magnanimity, forgiving his captor but never forgetting. For a brief time, peace returned. But the kingmaker's pride would not rest. In 1470, Warwick gambled everything on a second uprising. Clarence joined him once more, the banners of rebellion unfurling in Lincolnshire. Yet this time, Edward moved faster, crushing the revolt at Loosecoat Field. Warwick and Clarence fled across the Channel to France, fugitives and outlaws. It was there, in the glittering court of Louis XI, that fate performed its cruelest twist. The exiled Yorkist and the exiled Lancastrian, Warwick and Queen Margaret of Anjou, met face to face. For years they had been mortal enemies. Now necessity forged an impossible alliance. Margaret demanded the restoration of her husband Henry VI to the throne. Warwick, desperate to regain his power, agreed. The man who had once dethroned the Lancastrians now swore to return them to rule. In the autumn of 1470, Warwick landed in Devon with French troops at his back. The country, weary of endless instability, wavered in its loyalties. Clarence's defection lent the invasion legitimacy. One by one, the Yorkist garrisons crumbled. Edward, taken by surprise, saw his support vanish like mist. With Warwick's brother John Neville joining the rebellion, even the loyal North turned against him. By October, Warwick marched triumphantly into London. Henry VI, pale and broken after years of captivity, was led from the Tower and placed once more upon the throne. Bells rang across the capital. The red rose had risen again, the prodigal king restored. Warwick, resplendent in crimson robes, stood beside him as Lord High Admiral and de facto ruler of England. Yet the triumph was an illusion. Henry was a figurehead, Margaret remained in exile, and Edward IV still lived. Across the sea, in the court of Burgundy, the deposed Yorkist king watched and waited. Warwick had made kings before, but this time the king he created would destroy him. In the winter of 1470, England lay under the uneasy peace of a hollow restoration. The bells of London tolled for the return of Henry VI, but they rang over a city divided. The once great king sat in Westminster like a ghost, gentle, pliant, and barely conscious of the realm he was said to rule. The real power belonged to Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker reborn as England's master. Yet even as he sat upon the council, issuing orders in Henry's name, Warwick knew his triumph was fragile. He had restored the red rose, but his hands still bore the thorns of betrayal. Across the Channel, in the court of Charles the Bold of Burgundy, the exiled Edward IV brooded in silence. He had fled England disguised as a common sailor, escaping Warwick's invasion by a heartbeat. Now, stripped of his crown and wealth, he sought aid from the same Burgundy that Warwick had spurned. But Charles, wary of angering France, offered only token support. For months Edward lingered in the port of Bruges, a king without a throne, his small retinue dwindling, his hope flickering. Then fortune shifted. France and Burgundy, eternal rivals, tilted toward war. Louis XV, now allied with Warwick, threatened Burgundian trade across the Channel. Charles, seeing his interests endangered, changed course. Quietly, he funded Edward's return, providing ships, gold, and a few hundred mercenaries. It was not an army, it was a gamble. Edward accepted with a soldier's calm. "I have lost a kingdom before," he's said to have told his captains, "and I shall win it again." In March 1471, Edward landed on the Yorkshire coast with barely 2,000 men. He carried no royal banners, no crown, only the claim of the Duke of York, insisting he sought not to usurp Henry, but to reclaim his inheritance. It was a lie of necessity, designed to ease open the gates of the northern towns. And it worked. York welcomed him in silence. Nottingham declared for him days later. Like a spark catching dry grass, Edward's march gathered momentum. By the time he reached the Midlands, his forces had swelled to 10,000. Old comrades rallied. Lord Hastings, the loyal Gloucester, and even his treacherous brother George, Duke of Clarence, who, realizing Warwick's promises had soured, defected once more to Edward's side. The brothers embraced before their men, the gesture sealing a temporary but vital unity. In London, panic spread. Warwick had stationed his ally Edmund, Duke of Somerset, to defend the capital, but the city's merchants, long favoring Yorkist stability, refused to fight. The gates were thrown open, and Edward entered London to the cheers of the crowd. In a moment heavy with irony, he walked into the Tower and greeted Henry VI, who had been restored to the throne only months earlier. The gentle old king was once again a prisoner, and Edward, without a single pitched battle, was once again King of England. But Warwick was not done. He had retreated north to rally his army, gathering men loyal to Lancaster, and those still dazzled by his reputation. The armies met near the village of Barnet on the eve of April 14th, 1471. Mist cloaked the fields that night, dense, shifting, and blinding. Each side could hear the other's campfires but not see them. Edward deployed his men in silence. Hastings on the left, his brother Richard of Gloucester, barely 18, on the right, and himself in the center. Warwick commanded the opposing host, his brother John Neville beside him, his ranks swollen with knights who believed they fought to save the realm from chaos. At dawn, cannon fire split the fog. The two armies stumbled forward, each unaware that they had drawn their lines askew. Warwick's left outflanked Edward's right. Edward's right outflanked Warwick's left. The battle devolved into a brutal close-quarters brawl. Steel clashed in the mist, men fought by instinct, striking friend and foe alike. Warwick's ally Oxford broke through Edward's flank and pursued his enemies toward London, but his men, looting the king's baggage, lost formation. When they returned, their banners, gold stars on red, were mistaken for Edward's emblem, the blazing sun. Confused archers on Warwick's line loosed volleys into their own men. Shouts of treason echoed through the fog, and the Lancastrian line began to collapse. Edward seized the moment. Leading his reserve forward, he struck Warwick's weakened center with a ferocity that shattered it. The mist lifted just long enough for the truth to be seen. Warwick and his brother were surrounded. They fought to the last, refusing to flee. When it was over, their bodies lay in the mud, pierced by arrows and stripped of armor. The kingmaker, the man who had created two kings and destroyed both, was dead. His death marked more than the end of a rebellion. It marked the death of an era. The feudal nobility that had once rivaled the crown had fallen with him. From now on, England would be ruled by kings, not by kingmakers. Edward, weary but unbroken, stood amid the carnage as the fog cleared. He had reclaimed his throne by courage, cunning, and the frailty of those who had underestimated him. But even as he gave thanks to God and buried his fallen foe with honor, he knew the war was not done. Across the sea, Margaret of Anjou and her son, Prince Edward, were sailing for England with a fresh army and vengeance in their hearts. Warwick was gone, but the Red Rose was not yet dead. And Edward, though victorious, would have to face the Queen who had never learned to yield. The news of Warwick's death reached Queen Margaret of Anjou as her ship neared the southern coast of England in late April 1471. For a moment she could not believe it. Her greatest ally, her last hope for reclaiming her husband's throne, was gone before she had even set foot on English soil. Yet the Queen, who had fought a lifetime of wars, did not weep. She gathered her son, Prince Edward of Westminster, and said, "Then we must win this crown ourselves." Landing at Weymouth, Margaret's army numbered barely 6,000. Loyal Lancastrian knights, French mercenaries, and remnants of northern lords still faithful to the Red Rose. Her goal was to reach Wales, where Jasper Tudor, Henry VI's half-brother, commanded men and fortresses loyal to her cause. If the two forces could unite, they might challenge Edward IV anew. But the king, swift and relentless, had already begun his pursuit. Edward moved with extraordinary speed, covering over 200 miles in less than 2 weeks. He left London only days after Barnet, leaving Henry VI imprisoned once more in the Tower. Margaret's army, weary and slowed by baggage and artillery, trudged north through the wooded hills of Gloucestershire. On May 3rd, they reached the small market town of Tewkesbury, beside the River Severn. The bridges to Wales were blocked. Exhausted, Margaret had no choice but to turn and fight. At dawn on May 4th, the two armies faced one another across rolling meadows and tangled hedgerows. The Lancastrians held the high ground, 3 divisions under Somerset, Wenlock, and Prince Edward himself. Behind them, the Queen waited with her small reserve. Edward IV arranged his troops opposite, flanked by his brothers, Gloucester on one side, Clarence on the other. The Yorkists had the advantage in artillery, their cannon thundering across the fields as smoke drifted through the morning haze. The first clash came when Somerset, perhaps eager to redeem his name after years of disgrace, spotted a weakness on the Yorkist left. He led a daring flanking charge through the hedges, striking Edward's line with fury. For a moment the royal army buckled, arrows flying, men falling, banners toppling. But Edward's discipline held. The king rallied his men personally, shouting above the din, his armor gleaming like firelight through the smoke. Then, from the woods, a hidden detachment of Yorkist cavalry, kept in reserve precisely for this moment, charged into Somerset's exposed flank. Panic spread. Somerset's men were cut to pieces or driven into the marshes. The Duke himself rode back to the Lancastrian lines, cursing his comrades for failing to support him. According to chroniclers, he struck down Lord Wenlock with his axe in a fit of rage before being surrounded and killed. The line crumbled. Edward seized the opening, ordering a full advance. Drums thundered, trumpets blared. The White Rose surged forward. The battle became a rout. Lancastrian soldiers fled through the meadows, pursued by mounted Yorkist knights who cut them down without mercy. Some tried to cross the nearby abbey grounds, crying sanctuary. Others were cornered and slaughtered in a place still remembered as the Bloody Meadow. By afternoon, the field was silent, but for the crows circling above. Among the prisoners was Prince Edward, the last hope of the Lancastrian dynasty. Brought before Edward IV, he stood proud despite defeat. Accounts differ, but legend holds that when asked how he dared invade his rightful sovereign's realm, the young prince replied, "To recover my father's inheritance." Edward IV struck him, and his attendants fell upon the boy with swords. When the bloodied body of Prince Edward was carried away, the Red Rose of Lancaster died with him. Queen Margaret, captured soon after, was led to London in chains. Her husband, Henry VI, still a captive in the Tower, would not live to see her again. On the night of May 21st, the king was found dead in his cell. Officially, he died of melancholy. Unofficially, few doubted Edward had ordered the deed. The long duel between Lancaster and York was over. One house extinguished, the other enthroned by blood. Edward IV returned to London to the roar of triumph. The banners of rebellion were torn down, the bodies of Warwick, Somerset, and the prince were buried with little ceremony. To the people of England weary of war, it seemed peace had finally returned. But peace born of slaughter is never pure. The victors carried ghosts with them, of fathers killed, brothers lost, loyalties betrayed. In the quiet halls of the Tower, a boy of 14, Henry Tudor, nephew of the fallen Jasper, listened to the rumors of defeat. His claim to the throne was distant, his power non-existent. Yet history has a way of nurturing seeds in the darkest soil. The roses had fallen, but the Garden of England was not yet still. The summer of 1471 dawned under a banner of triumph. Edward IV was once again master of England, his enemies slain, his rivals scattered, his crown unchallenged. From the ashes of civil war, he sought to build a dynasty. The Yorkist sun now shone in full splendor. London celebrated him as a restorer of peace. Merchants reopened their trade routes. The great lords bent the knee. Yet in the silence following victory, a different kind of danger began to bloom, not rebellion, but complacency. Edward, unlike the frail Henry VI, ruled with both charisma and calculation. He rewarded loyalty generously, restored confiscated lands, and reinstated law across a realm shattered by decades of feudal strife. The Star Chamber sat again in judgment. Markets thrived. The gold nobles stamped with his face gleamed across Europe. To the common people, it was as if a golden age had begun. But to those who knew him, Edward's peace was built not on trust, but on exhaustion. The nobles obeyed him because they feared another Towton, another Tewkesbury, another field sown with their sons' bones. In the shadows of that uneasy peace, the last remnants of the Red Rose struggled to survive. Henry Tudor, now 14, had fled England after Tewkesbury with his uncle Jasper Tudor. Their small ship was caught in a Channel storm and driven onto the shores of Brittany. There, the local Duke, Francis II, took them in, half hostages, half refugees. Henry's bloodline, through his mother Margaret Beaufort, traced back to John of Gaunt, a son of Edward III, but through the illegitimate Beaufort line, long barred from succession. Still, in a land weary of Yorkist rule, such a claim was enough to keep his name alive. Back in England, Edward sought to secure what war had won. His brother George, Duke of Clarence, restless and ambitious, was granted estates and wealth beyond measure. Yet the bond between the brothers, once reforged on the road to London, slowly rotted. Clarence, haunted by his shifting loyalties, feared that Edward trusted him no more than he had trusted Warwick. He was right. The king's patience with treachery had grown thin. Meanwhile, Edward's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, proved his truest ally. While Edward ruled the south and centre, Richard governed the north with iron discipline. He restored order in Yorkshire, curbed corruption, and won the respect of both commoners and gentry. In him, Edward saw the same resolve that had carried them through Barnet and Towton. But others saw a man too disciplined, too quiet, too calculating, a shadow of the king himself. By 1475, Edward turned his gaze once again toward France. The old dream of his great-grandfather Edward III still haunted English kings: the claim to the French crown. With the coffers refilled and his armies rebuilt, Edward crossed the Channel in a glittering campaign meant more to display strength than to fight. Yet when Louis XV met him at Picquigny, it was not with swords but gold. The two kings signed a treaty that promised peace, and a pension so rich it made war unnecessary. Edward returned to England without a single battle, richer than he had ever been. The nobles cheered, but some whispered the warrior had become a merchant king. For the next few years, the realm prospered, but peace sharpened rivalries where war had once dulled them. Clarence's arrogance became unbearable. His plots against Edward multiplied. In 1478, after one final act of defiance, accusing the queen's kin of witchcraft, he was arrested and condemned. The legend says he was executed in the Tower, drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, a cruel poetic gesture befitting the twisted loyalties of the age. Edward ruled on, stronger than ever yet, surrounded by ghosts. Warwick, Henry VI, the prince at Tewkesbury, and now Clarence, all victims of his rise. He had slain rebellion, but not ambition. The crown weighed heavier with every passing year. His court grew lavish, his waistline broad, his nights filled with wine and whispers. For all his victories, he began to feel the cost of kingship in the hollow quiet of his later reign. In 1483, after years of indulgence and illness, Edward IV's great heart failed him. He was only 40. On his deathbed, he named his brother Richard of Gloucester as protector for his 12-year-old son, Edward V. The transition seemed secure. But in a realm where bloodlines had been swords for 30 years, peace was a mirage. The sun in splendor dimmed, and in its shadow stirred ambition once more. For England, the wars of the roses were not over. They were merely changing shape. The last act would not be written in parchment or treaty, but in betrayal, and the bloodline of York was about to devour itself. The death of Edward IV in April 1483 was like the sudden snuffing of a candle, leaving behind darkness, confusion, and the faint echo of unfinished plans. His heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old, bright, precocious, and beloved by his father. His coronation was already arranged, the regency assigned to his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the same loyal brother who had ruled the north with quiet discipline. Yet the peace Edward had built was a house of glass. The moment the king died, cracks began to form. The queen's family, the Woodvilles, moved swiftly. Her brother, Earl Rivers, escorted the boy king south toward London with a large retinue, seeking to crown him quickly and secure their influence over the young monarch. But to Richard of Gloucester, this haste was no act of loyalty. It was a coup in disguise. With the support of Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, he intercepted the royal procession near Stony Stratford. Rivers and his allies were arrested. The boy king, confused but compliant, was taken into Gloucester's custody. The excuse was one of protection. The reality, silent usurpation. When Richard and Edward V entered London weeks later, the city greeted them cautiously. The Queen had fled into Westminster Abbey with her younger son Richard, Duke of York, claiming sanctuary. From the pulpit of St. Paul's, Richard swore his loyalty to the young king. "I seek no crown," he declared, "but only the good governance of England." Few believed him. In private, his allies were already whispering that the late king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, that her children were born of sin and thus bastards unfit to rule. By early June, both princes were lodged within the Tower of London, ostensibly to await the coronation. The tower was still a royal residence then, not yet the symbol of doom it would become. The boys were often seen at play on the ramparts, waving to onlookers. Yet as days turned to weeks, their appearances grew rarer. In Parliament, Richard's supporters pressed the claim of illegitimacy, citing secret pre-contracts and rumors of sorcery. The air around the throne thickened with menace. On June 25th, a council of nobles declared Edward IV's children illegitimate. 2 days later, the Archbishop of York proclaimed Richard of Gloucester the rightful king. The crowd that gathered at Westminster Hall shouted their acclamations, but even chroniclers noted that the cheers were forced. The next morning, Richard III rode through London in coronation robes, beneath banners bearing his emblem, the white boar, gleaming where the sun in splendor once had. And the princes? They were never seen again. Accounts differ, but none end happily. The last reported sighting came in the late summer of 1483, two pale figures glimpsed at dusk through the tower's barred windows. Then silence. Rumors spread of secret assassins, of smothered cries in the night, of burials beneath the staircase. Richard denied all wrongdoing, blaming conspirators, the Queen, even fate. Yet the shadow of those two vanished boys clung to him like a curse. In every market and tavern, whispers grew. The king is a child killer. Still, Richard ruled with formidable energy. He reformed laws, curbed corruption, and distributed justice with surprising fairness. Many in the north adored him, yet in the south, distrust festered. His legitimacy rested on fear, not faith. When rebellion flared that autumn, led by Henry Stafford, the same Duke of Buckingham who had once been his ally, it seemed England would burn again. The revolt failed, and Buckingham was executed. But the rebellion's true consequence was to summon back an old ghost from across the sea. In exile in Brittany, Henry Tudor had watched England's turmoil with growing purpose. For years, he had been a pawn in continental politics, his name a faint echo of the vanished Lancasters. Now, as Richard's reign darkened under rumor and suspicion, that echo became a rallying cry. Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, a woman as relentless as any queen, sent secret letters across the Channel, pledging alliances and money. Old Yorkists who despised Richard began to see Henry not as an enemy, but as a cure. By the end of 1484, the realm trembled once more on the edge of destiny. The red rose and the white, both stained by 30 years of war, were about to merge in one final gamble. And in the west, across the narrow sea, a quiet young man with a cautious smile and haunted eyes was preparing to stake everything on that gamble. His name was Henry Tudor. His banner bore the Red Dragon of Wales, and his march would end in a field called Bosworth. The summer of 1485 was one of restless rumor. In every inn and village, talk spread that Henry Tudor, long exiled in Brittany and France, was coming home. For years his claim had been a distant fantasy, the dream of desperate men, but now ships had been sighted off the Welsh coast. Richard III, only 2 years into his reign, felt the tremor in his kingdom's heart. The crown he had seized so coldly was beginning to burn. On August 7th, Henry landed at Milford Haven with a small army of French mercenaries and loyal exiles, barely 5,000 men. Yet his arrival in Wales changed everything. The land of his birth rose to meet him. Welsh gentry, invoking ancient prophecy, hailed him as the Mab Dargan, the son of destiny, who would unite the realm. His red dragon banner, unfurled against the sea wind, became the emblem of renewal. Step by step, Henry's army swelled as he marched inland through Shrewsbury toward the Midlands. Richard moved swiftly, gathering 10,000 men under his royal standard, the White Boar, and marching from Leicester to intercept the invader. His position was strong, his numbers overwhelming. But one thing Richard could not command was loyalty. Among his lords stood Thomas Stanley, husband to Henry's mother, and his brother William, each with thousands of soldiers. Outwardly, they served the king, but their allegiance was a coin waiting to be flipped. On the night of August 21st, both armies encamped near Bosworth, the air heavy with rain and anticipation. Richard slept poorly, his dreams haunted by omens. At dawn, he rode the line, his voice still fierce. Fight boldly for your king. Victory today crowns England's peace forever." Across the field, Henry's men knelt in silence. Many had never seen battle. Fewer still believed they could defeat a king, but their leader's quiet composure steadied them. He was not a warrior by birth, yet he carried himself with the calm of one who has nothing left to lose. The battle began mid-morning. Drums pounded, arrows hissed through the mist, and the thunder of artillery echoed over the moors. Henry's commander, John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, led the charge, striking Richard's right flank and forcing the royal gunners to cease fire. The fight was brutal and close, lines surging, breaking, reforming in the mud. The Stanleys stood apart, watching, their troops unmoving, their intentions unreadable. Richard's main force pressed forward, slowly overpowering Henry's smaller host. From a hilltop, the king saw Henry and his personal guard separated on the far side of the field. In that moment, he made a decision that would define him forever. Spurring his horse, Richard led 1,000 knights in a direct charge toward Henry's banner, determined to end the war with a single blow. His cry rang across the field, "Treason or not, I'll die a king!" The charge smashed through Henry's line, scattering his standard bearers. The young Tudor himself was nearly cut down before Oxford's pikemen wheeled around to block the onslaught. The melee swirled in chaos, steel, sweat, and screams. Then, at the crucial moment, William Stanley ordered his men forward, striking Richard's flank. Outnumbered and surrounded, the king fought on foot, hacking his way through the press. Chroniclers say he slew Henry's standard-bearer himself before being overwhelmed. Richard III died fighting, the crown torn from his head in the mud. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. As silence fell, Henry's men retrieved the battered circlet from the field and placed it upon his head. On that blood-soaked hill, he was proclaimed Henry VII, King of England, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. The red rose and the white had at last been reconciled, though the soil that joined them was dark with blood. In Leicester, Richard's body was carried naked across a horse, his face bruised, his back gashed by wounds. He was buried without ceremony, England's last king to die in battle. But in death, as in life, he remained a figure of haunting contradiction, both tyrant and warrior, villain and victim. For Henry, the victory was fragile but fateful. He had seized the throne not by divine right, but by the sword. Yet he understood what his predecessors had not, that peace could not be won by blood alone. His first act as king would not be vengeance, but marriage. He would wed Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV, uniting the rival houses beneath a single rose, the Tudor rose, red and white entwined. The Wars of the Roses had ended, but England would never again be the same. The feudal world that had birthed it was gone. A new age of monarchy was dawning, forged not in chivalry, but in power, not in honor, but in survival. The fields of Bosworth fell silent, but the echoes of that morning would shape England for centuries to come. The day after Bosworth, England awoke in uneasy quiet. For 30 years, the red and white roses had drenched its soil in blood. Fathers and sons had fought on opposite sides. Noble houses, once proud, had been extinguished. Now a new banner flew over the battlefield, the red dragon of Wales, glinting beneath the pale August sun. The man who bore it, Henry Tudor, was an unlikely king, a cautious exile, thin and grave, whose claim to the throne rested more on exhaustion than birthright. But in a land broken by dynastic war, caution was a strength. England had gambled on warriors and dreamers. Now it sought a survivor. Henry's first act was neither vengeance nor triumph, but legitimacy. He dated his reign from the day before Bosworth, so that every man who had fought for Richard could be labeled a traitor. Yet he avoided mass reprisals, understanding too well how rebellion breeds in grief. Instead, he moved swiftly to bind wounds with marriage. On January 18, 1486, in Westminster Abbey, Henry VII wed Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. The union was simple but symbolic. The red rose of Lancaster joined with the white of York, forming the Tudor rose, a new emblem for a scarred nation. The ceremony was more than a wedding, it was an exorcism. Bells rang across London, echoing through streets still haunted by memory, the heads on pikes, the chants of mobs, the ashes of rebellion. For the first time in a generation, the realm saw both factions kneel together before the same altar. Chroniclers wrote that many wept, others simply stared, wondering if peace could truly outlast the ceremony. Henry himself stood solemn, his expression unreadable. He knew peace was not given, it was engineered. He began his reign with ruthless practicality. The great nobles who had caused decades of anarchy were tamed by new laws of bonds and recognizances, financial shackles that made rebellion ruinous. He built an administration of clerks, accountants, and lawyers rather than warlords, transforming the crown from a feudal prize into a centralized institution. The days of private armies and castle politics were fading. Henry ruled with pen and purse as much as with sword. Still, ghosts lingered. In 1486, a year after Bosworth, rebellion flared under Francis Lovell and the Stafford brothers, Yorkist survivors who had fled the battlefield. Henry moved with quiet efficiency, offering pardons to most but hunting down the ringleaders. Lovell escaped abroad, but others were executed, coldly, methodically, without spectacle. The message was clear. England's civil wars were over, and mercy would be measured. Yet peace was fragile. In 1487, a new threat emerged. An Oxford priest named Richard Simons presented a boy named Lambert Simnel, claiming he was Edward, Earl of Warwick, the last male heir of York. The real Warwick languished in the Tower, but in an age of rumor, truth mattered less than belief. Backed by Irish lords and mercenaries from Burgundy, Simnel was crowned Edward VI in Dublin. It was the final gasp of the old order, the red rose rising once more to crush the phantom of the white. Henry moved north, his banners bearing the Tudor rose. On June 16, 1487, his army met the rebels at East Stoke in Nottinghamshire. The battle was fierce but brief. The rebel ranks, poorly armored Irish levies, and German mercenaries broke beneath the weight of Henry's disciplined troops. The slaughter was merciless. Thousands cut down in a ravine now remembered as the Red Gutter. The false king, Simnel, was captured and, astonishingly, spared. Henry made him a kitchen servant, turning mockery into mercy. It was the final battle of the Wars of the Roses, and the Tudor dynasty was born in its aftermath. Under Henry VII, England would slowly emerge from feudal darkness. The monarchy became less the prize of noble ambition and more the machinery of state. Trade expanded, law deepened, and the seeds of the English Renaissance took root. The old age of knights and banners had ended. The new age of bureaucracy, diplomacy, and dynastic survival had begun. Yet even as he secured peace, Henry ruled with a watchful eye. He trusted few, smiled rarely, and carried the memory of Bosworth like a scar beneath his robes. Perhaps he understood that power won by war could never fully escape its shadow. His dynasty would hold the throne for more than a century, his son Henry VIII, his granddaughter Elizabeth I stars. But behind every Tudor victory lay the ghost of the roses, whispering that peace in England was never free. As twilight fell over the 15th century, chroniclers looked back on the Wars of the Roses as a national nightmare, a storm of ambition, treachery, and blood. But from that storm emerged the England of the future, centralized, disciplined, and newly aware of its own fragility. The roses had finally ceased to bloom, but their thorns had shaped a kingdom.